Welcome to our video. We are That Group, a Canadian magazine publication. In today's video, we are presenting to you the graphics department's automated workflow on how images and other digital files are required to be standardized and to get them ready for the editorial team. This process has been simplified to organize files for our editorial department. The point of this automated workflow is to make the transferring of files to the editorial team organized and easier to navigate. This workflow avoids common workflow issues such as improper document setup, low density of files, disorganization of files, improper file naming conventions, or unsupported files that could disrupt and put the workflow behind. Before we get into the workflow, I will be going over the workflow elements and its properties to better understand its role in the workflow. To begin with, this is the mail receive element. This is an action workflow element where clients send us their files. Similar to this, we have the mail sent element, where we send an email to our clients or project managers to alert them on the issues of the files we've received. Here we have the uncompressed workflow element, where it decompresses zip files and puts these files into the unarchived files folder in a workflow. Here we have the job dismantler element, where the files that came in a zip file decompresses and becomes a folder. So this workflow element helps bring the files into the next folder, supported files, as individual files rather than a folder. In this section, you will notice that these workflow elements are icons of familiar application softwares that a magazine would use. Each of the application software workflow elements or droplets, such as the Adobe Illustrator, Adobe InDesign, and Word elements, they all indicate the exporting of files from their respective native file formats into PDFs, which are sent to the PDFs files folder. As for the remaining application software workflow elements, here we have the Adobe Photoshop droplet or element, where it indicates the exporting of Photoshop files, TIFF files, and PNG files to JPEG files. Next, we have the XMP pickup element, where it picks up the PDF's metadata, which is then sent to the PDF with XMP folder, or picks up the JPEG's metadata, which is then sent to the JPEG with XMP folder. Here we have the rename job element, where it takes the metadata from the PDFs and renames the PDFs based on their defined variables and adds a suffix of _editorial to the file's name to help indicate that these files are for the editorial department. This would also help track where the file is in the workflow. These job elements appear with the JPEG workflow as well, and it does the same thing where the XMP pickup element picks up the metadata and rename job element does the same thing with the PDFs except with JPEGs. As for the last workflow element, this is the InFocus Pit Stop Server element. It takes the renamed PDFs from the renamed PDF folder and works as a pre-flighting mechanism where it removes the blank trailing pages and checks if the PDF has the proper resolution. When the workflow element sees that the PDF has improper resolution, it fails to go to the Print Ready PDFs folder and goes to the non-Print Ready PDFs folder, where it will be emailed to the client or project manager to highlight the issue of the file so they can fix and send in the proper files. So as for the demonstration for the workflow here, I'll be just taking the test files and dropping them off into our workflow just to show you how it works. But as of right now, I'm just dropping them off into the input folder and activating the workflow, of course, in order for this to work. And since the background's all gray, we can now assume that the workflow is working, and the files are now just gonna go through certain folders and elements, and as you can see, they're slowly being sorted into the incoming files folder, where it ultimately brings them into non-supported or supported files. The supported files are then filtered out by their native files and are then, depending on the workflow, they're either turned into a PDF or a JPEG. Because of this workflow, we can anticipate Illustrator files, InDesign files, and Word files to become PDFs. And as for JPEGs, we can anticipate for PSD or Photoshop files, TIFF files, or PNG files, as other forms of files. But with our workflow, we want JPEGs. So as you can see here, we have our Illustrator files, turning and exporting as PDF files as it opens in Acrobat. And now just back to the workflow, and we can see that the PDFs have gone through the XMP pickup and rename elements, and are now being filtered out as properly set up, or if they were properly set up, then they go through the InFocus pit stop server element where it pre-flights, which essentially removes trailing blank pages or fixes resolution and so forth. As of right now, Photoshop opened, which means we're on the bottom half of our workflow, the JPEG workflow, where a bunch of the Photoshop / PNG / TIFF files have exported as JPEGs and have bypassed through similar elements with the XMP pickup and rename job elements, and ultimately ends at the working JPEGs folder. As for the PDFs, once it goes through the pit stop server element, it either is a PDF that isn't appropriate for editorial to use, or is ready to use for editorial. So if not appropriate, it goes to the non-print ready PDFs and will be mailed to the project manager, and if ready, then we end up in the print ready PDFs. So that was all for the workflow, and thank you for listening to our presentation.